So for the purpose of today's class, we are really going to be looking at the development of the Northeast Asian sphere. And if you can remember, all that we talked about since the beginning of the semester of the last couple of weeks, right? One of the big issues or big themes that we touched on was this whole issue of, how China, the Chinese landmass, the Japanese archipelago, and the Korean peninsula were quite different and diverse. The people that sort of settled in these different geographical areas were distinct from each other. Their experiences were quite different. The Korean Peninsula, for example, really only had bronze and iron technology implemented round about the beginning of the first millennium BC, and the nature of their cultures was somewhat different all the way through to the first millennium BC, when they began to share some of the same kinds of cultural and social evolutions that we see on the North Chinese plains. Japan had a very, very different sort of trajectory. But what we do see by the time we get to the first millennium AD is that they begin to sort of converge and coalesce together culturally, socially, such that they shared interesting similarities. And the result was that by the middle of the first millennium AD, the development was known as a Northeast Asian cultural sphere or sinosphere. And many of the characteristics of this cultural sphere had what we call, traits that were Chinese in origin, right? So that's really sort of pretty much what we're going to be talking about today. So just to begin with, the last session we were talking about China becoming a unitary state. We had a class lecture looking at, all the things that were done to bring Chinese society not only into a single territorial entity and a geopolitical entity or state, but also from there, a resulting standardization process was occurring, right? So first you had the implementation and the putting in of a bureaucratic administrative structure through the entire territory, as well as the population that was consolidated under the Qin dynasty from 221 BC onwards. Along with that was the standardization of such things as the written language, the currency that was used, and even down to mensuration or measurement systems, including the weights systems, volumetric systems, and sort of measurement systems. The Qin dynasty didn't really last very long. The dynasty over sort of all of China really only lasted for about 8 years, even though the state of the kingdom of Qin had been around for a couple of centuries already. So when the emperor who inaugurated the all under heaven China, called the Qin dynasty in 221 BC, when he passed away in 213 BC, the entire state of China sort of collapsed under the weight, right, of the tremendous stress of its weight. It was a huge state. It didn't have enough time to consolidate as a singular state. And so because of that, different fief lords began to break away from the Qin dynasty once the emperor demised in 213 BC. There was a period of fighting no more than about a decade, out of which in 206 BC, a rival clan with their military leaders and political leaders managed to emerge victorious and establish what was known as the Han Dynasty in 206 BC. And one of the things that the Han Dynasty did was not to eradicate everything that the Qin Dynasty did, but instead reinforced it, adopted the best practices, got rid of the ones that were kind of a little, challenging to deal with, especially with regards to political philosophers, co-opted the Confucian scholars. And the result was a 400-year dynastic rule. That was a really, really long period of time, but which then allowed for the reinforcement of the real characteristics of the Qin dynasty that the Qin dynasty established over China, including the use of a standardized written language. For example, the use of the currency, which we saw in last week's lecture, in terms of the cast coins with, the round coins with a square hole in the middle, and, the weights systems, and so on and so forth, including the territorial administrative systems. So much so that that kind of a structured state became entrenched as part of the political culture of China, and continued to do so for the next 2,000 years, all the way until actually the present century. So much so that by about 220 AD, I think it's safe to say that China had become, as a culture and a society, the state became an integral part, right, of this particular state and this particular culture. And so this is just a map just to remind you of the territorial extent of the Qin Empire. All right. And then, of course, there were some things that were done, including the casting of currencies, for example, standardizing the currencies into these sort of circular currencies, the round copper coinage with a square hole in the middle so that you could string it up together. They got rid of all these different sort of variant types of currencies from all the regions of the Chinese landmass and really just adopted this particular one. And out of that, after the Qin dynasty collapsed in 213 BC, when the Han dynasty took over much of China in 206 BC, only a couple of years down the road, they didn't change the entire system and come up with a new coinage. Instead, they adopted the one that was implemented by the Qin dynasty so that there was some form of continuity. And these practices continued for the next 400 years until the Han dynasty collapsed in 221 AD. Same too with the systems of weights and measurements. All of these continued to be adopted and practiced under the Han dynasty for the next 400 years. And the language standardization continued as well from the Qin practice with the same characters, and obviously more were added to them, so that the written language of officialdom became increasingly complex. And not only was it an administrative language by the time you got to 220 AD, after 400 years of Han dynastic rule, it also became the basis of classical literary language in China as well. So that was how pervasive it was after 400 years, right? So along with that were a couple of things that we talked about, one of which was, of course, the standardization of how administrative cities were supposed to be laid out, right? And so here you have the city that looked in a grid form, usually a square with a wall that surrounded, the city, and that became the perimeters. And then you have watchtowers on the sides, like these, for example. Those kinds of a city layout became sort of the standard practice under the Qin dynasty, and again was inherited by the Han, so much so that by 220 AD, all Chinese administrative cities, both secondary as well as primary cities, had such a layout, right? And it was recognizable as an administrative center. We see something like this, as you were approaching a city, if it looked like a square, it had these watchtowers, and as you entered it, it had these three major thoroughfares in a north, south, and east, west kind of orientation. Basically you were in a Chinese city. So all of these things were done under the Han dynasty. And the other thing that the Han dynasty did, particularly in the first 150 years of the dynastic reign of the Han, sort of a dynastic house, were a couple of military campaigns that led to the enlargement of the Chinese territorial boundaries. And so you see on this map a couple of very interesting ones. The Han Chinese were militarily quite capable for the first 150 years of its rule until about 50 BC, where it started to wane. And then from there on, it was a pretty long sort of decline, where the state was big, it had a lot of money, but it wasn't really quite powerful, and territorially, it wasn't really performing absolutely well. But the first 150 years of its reign, particularly, I think, in the middle to the end of the 2nd century BC, so around about 150 to 100 BC, thereabouts, you had a series of very powerful emperors who were very martial and very military. And so the military of the Han dynasty was very powerful and it's at its peak at that time. A couple of places where the Han dynasty extended into, which are important for us, obviously, one would be into Central Asia, which is here. And for those of you who can remember your map quiz, places like Dunhuang, for example, right, out in Chinese Central Asia, these were cities that were established under the Han Dynasty as the gateway into Central Asia and then to the rest of Asia via the overland land route of the Silk Road. So those were established around about the middle to the late 2nd century BC, around about 130 to 120 BC thereabouts. So there would be one. The other series of military conquests were on the southern sort of borders, bordering what would today be North Vietnam. So this would be the extent of the North Vietnamese territories today, right? This is North Vietnam. And the Han Dynasty expanded militarily southwards into such places, including the coastline, right, of South China, which at the time were occupied by people, right? There were people there, but not necessarily what we would consider like Chinese-speaking people. They were kind of a mix between Southeast Asian and Sinitic people, and so this South Chinese and coastline in particular, along with northern Vietnam, was another sort of important sort of set of territorial holdings that the Han Empire extended over the course of the late 2nd century BC. The third one, which is very important for our understanding in this class, in this particular course, is the military campaigns that pushed the Chinese borders into the Korean Peninsula. Okay, and here we're talking about the North Korean Peninsula, and so around about the end of the 2nd century BC, the Han armies, Han military was moving across this part of the North Central Plains and then into the northern half of the Korean Peninsula, and the result was that it established a series of commanderies up here in this particular territorial holding that they established by the end of the 2nd century BC. So all of that is to say that a couple of things occurred along, obviously, with the military campaigning and the extension of territories. One would be that you're starting to see the outward exportation, right, or push-out exportation of Chinese political culture, state building, bureaucracy, language, right, currency, and so on and so forth, right, out into Western Central Asia, as well as the Korean Peninsula, as well as southwards into, the southern coastline of what we see as South China today, as well as places like North Vietnam. And along with that push were the establishment of commanderies. And so in all these different places, what ended up happening was that you actually had military commanderies established here, for example, in this place. Let me see if I can get the pin up. Yep. So here, for example, in the Korean Peninsula, you had 4 military commanderies that were established. You had military commanderies established in all these different places. Okay, and so along with that were the descending of officials, right, from the imperial capital of Chang'an down to all these different places, and the establishment of Chinese sort of, the bureaucratic state in these places. And so that's probably one of the most important impact I think the Han Dynasty had on East Asia round about this point in time, round about 100, by about 100 BC. So of course, the big question is, how did these developments impact the societies on the borders of China, right? These neighboring regions, as it were. And if you look at the chronology of Northeast Asia, and you think about the Korean Peninsula, for example, and the Japanese archipelago, they do develop quite differently, right? So in terms of the Neolithic or the prehistoric period, right? The Korean Peninsula is primarily a Neolithic sort of culture. There were Neolithic cultures up until about the first millennium BC. In the Japanese archipelago, you see that going on all the way, interestingly, until, in fact, extending downwards to the Yayoi culture, which emerged in the Japanese archipelago around about 300 BC. Okay, and it is not until you get to the end of the first millennium BC, that bronze begins to emerge in the Japanese um, archipelago, right? Bronze usage and bronze exploitation emerges in the Japanese archipelago around about the end of the first millennium BC, so sort of going into the AD period. Whereas in Korea, the historical trajectory and the social organizational trajectory actually is quite different. So by about 700 BC, you get the emergence of a kind of proto-Korean kingdom known as the Gojoseon, or the old Choson, kingdom, because later on, about 1,000 or so years later on, there is another kingdom that took on this name and called itself the Choson. So the Koreans today call this particular one from 700 BC the old, right, the old Choson kingdom, and so that's why the name is called Go Choson, it's old Choson kingdom. And it mirrored the kind of states that were developing, in the spring autumn period, the warring states period of North China, that we saw over the last couple of sessions. Okay, but by about 108 BC, the northern part of the Korean peninsula, including the kingdom of Gojoseon, was militarily taken over by the Han military, and in its place, the Han dynasty established 4 commanderies on the northern part of the Korean peninsula, right? And when the Han dynasty, around about 50 BC, was no longer able to hold on to these commanderies anymore, and they withdrew, these commanderies then broke up to become independent kingdoms on the Korean peninsula, and that's where you get these 4 these 4 kingdoms on the Korean peninsula: the Goguryeo, Bakje, Silla, and Gaya. These kingdoms begin quite early. Most of them actually begin in the second half of the 1st century BC, so like 37 BC, for example, for the kingdom of Goguryeo. Bakje is established around about 18 BC, and then Silla is established in about 57 BC, quite around about the same time as, just a couple of years after the Han military withdraws from the Korean peninsula around about 50 BC, right? The only one on the Korean peninsula that's a latecomer really is the kingdom of Gaya, which is a conglomeration of various chiefdoms and tribal, groups together, and that establishes itself in AD 42. And these kingdoms actually go on for a substantial amount of time. Many of them last for around about 600 or so years, with Silla really surviving for almost about a full millennium. So that's about 1,000 years. That's a very, very long period of time. Now, if you compare that with what's going on the Japanese archipelago, it's quite a different story, because really on the Japanese archipelago, what you did have instead was a series of fiefdoms, right, that were centered around a particular sort of valley area where agriculture could be sort of developed quite well with the bronze technology, and also with cereal crop growing like rice, for example. Okay, so much so that you had a couple of powerful fiefs developing by about 250 AD, which is essentially the start of the Yamato period, and you see what is known as the Kofun period emerging around about 250 AD. So very, very late compared to what was going on in the Korean peninsula, and definitely a lot later than what was going on in China, right, where these state formational processes were occurring about 1,000 years or more before already. And the Japanese kingdoms do not really emerge until about the second half of the first millennium AD. And even then, they don't really last very long. Each of these kingdoms really only lasts about 200 years or so, or 100 years or so. And so the nature of state formational process on the Japanese archipelago is quite different from the Korean peninsula. So what are we looking at here? So essentially what you have are 4 commanderies that were established by the Han military by about 108 BC, right? So this is one here, Shentu, another one, Lelang, Lin Tun, and then Zhenfan, 4 of them the Han military did not manage to get to the southern half of the Korean peninsula. And so really, essentially, what we're really looking at were land invasions that were coming across from the Manchurian steppe lands. But once they established these commanderies, some basic sense of state organization was put in place, right? Military and administration, Chinese people started to migrate to these commanderies as well. And so along with that came all sorts of social, cultural practices, including like market economy, the use of, copper currencies, and so on and so forth, right? And when the Han military withdrew from these areas in 50 BC, these places continued to retain their Chinese administrative structures. And so out of that came the states of the Korean Peninsula, right, that we saw in this list here, okay? So as an example, what were some of these structures that were retained and how did they help? I think the state formational processes of Korean societies at this juncture, around about the end of the first millennium BC. So for the Kingdom of Bakche, for example, okay, which became an independent kingdom in 18 BC and lasted for the next sort of 600, almost 700 years. Effectively, the political structure had a ruler, and then it had 5 aristocratic families that were sort of, related to the ruler's family lineage. And so that formed the basis of the political or the socio-political elite. Along with that was they appointed one chief minister. It had a system of 16 official ranks. So you had a hierarchical sort of, official bureaucratic structure, right? So not the same as what was going on in China, but mirroring it extremely well, okay? In terms of the local administration, you had magistrates that were sent by the court. So the court of Pakche, or the Kingdom of Pakche, would send out, magistrates to these different territories within its own holding. And the purpose of it would be to administer the policies of the kingdom, but at the same time to collect agricultural tax and corvée labor tax. So you had infrastructural projects that needed to be executed. Those were the kind of things that would pay for it, right? Manpower plus money that came from the output of agricultural lands in that particular kingdom. This kingdom was so successful that its administrative structure was so entrenched that it was able to establish by the 7th century AD up to 200 cities that were administrative cities, of which the largest one had a population of about 715,000 people. So very large, and all of these systems were mirroring what the Chinese were doing and the system that the Chinese had brought by about 108 BC and left in place after they retreated in about 50 BC. All right. The Kingdom of Silla, on the other hand, which is on this side of the Korean Peninsula, did a couple of things that also sort of mirrored that sort of practice. One was that it institutionalized governmental structure. And so you had 2 main things, one of which was the establishment of the Ministry of War, because this was a point in time when the Korean kingdoms were very competitive. So if you can imagine territorial holdings within a space of the Korean Peninsula, it's not very big, okay? Kingdoms are constantly competing with each other. And so for the Kingdom of Silla, its primary imperative was to ensure that militarily it was fully capable of establishing itself, and then also with time extending its territory. So the Ministry of War was one of the most important institutional structures that it had put in place, and that mirrored the Ministry of War that we see in the Han Dynasty bureaucracy. Okay, along with that was taxes on agriculture. And so I think what we are seeing here is a pattern across Northeast Asia, where agriculture and the taxation of the output of the land became the primary basis for fiscal well-being, right? If you had a kingdom and you needed your kingdom to do well, one of the most important activities that you would tax was agriculture. And then by the late 7th century AD, we saw a whole series of different things put in place in the Kingdom of Silla. One was, of course, the postal system using horses so that you could transfer information or, sort of issue directives from the central court, out to the outlying areas, and that information could move pretty quickly on horseback. So the postal system was established by the 7th century AD, mirroring what was going on in China at this point in time as well. The Silla Kingdom also had a board of academicians. So these were ones who were scholars that instituted state testing for scholars who wanted to enter the bureaucracy, and the texts upon which they would conduct these exams were in fact the Confucian texts. So they didn't develop texts of their own. There was a version of Korean history that the Silla Kingdom had already developed by this time, and that was one. But the main corpus of text that any student who was hoping to become an official in the bureaucracy of the Kingdom of Silla had to study were the Confucian texts, and of course these were from China. So these were imported in from China, and those would be the texts that would be utilized for exams. The court also appointed a whole series of technocrats, including people like mathematicians, doctors, lawyers, and so on and so forth. And urban planning was, again, like the Kingdom of Bakche, one of the most important aspects of sort of, the visual manifestation of the well-being and the existence of the kingdom, right? So Gyeongju, for example, which is the historical capital of the Kingdom of Silla, looks like that, right? And if you think about it, it's a square, right, with east, west, and north, south, right, oriented streets, main thoroughfares. Okay, and so here is where you have the palace precinct, and these are all individual quarters or wards where people would live in, and this would be where all your villages and your families would be located, for your commoners. But this is where the palace is located, and it's surrounded by a wall, right? It's surrounded by an embankment. Let me just make sure that I get this back here. It's surrounded by a wall, and the walls all have what? Watchtower. Okay, so this is exactly like the urban layout of an administrative city or urban center, as we saw, right, from the Qin dynasty. Okay, and that as a urban planning concept was imported into the Kingdom of Silla and put to great effect. This map dates from the 18th century, obviously, because the Kingdom of Silla, the city of Gyeongju, from the 7th century doesn't exist anymore, and so this is a reproduction of a reproduction of a reproduction of maps that existed from that period of time. But I think it sort of illustrates that notion of the urban planning, logic extremely well. The other thing that was really interesting in the case of the Korean kingdoms was that there was a shift, at least at the state level, right, away from traditional Korean religious beliefs, which was primarily shamanism and animism, much like the Shang dynasty and the very early Zhou dynasty we saw a couple of weeks ago, to by about 360 AD, Buddhism being introduced into the Korean peninsula. And Buddhism became a state-sponsored religion. So it became essentially a state religion in the Silla Kingdom by about the mid-6th century AD. So it came to China from China. Buddhism came from China. And then by about 500 AD, was adopted by the Silla Kingdom as the official state religion, right? And so what that meant was that the state was now the patron of this very important religion that was prolific not only in the Indian subcontinent, but also by this time in China, in certain parts of Southeast Asia, and then now in the Korean Peninsula, it became the prerogative of the state. The version of Buddhism that was adopted in the Korean Peninsula was what was known as the Son Buddhism, or Chan Buddhism in China was known as Chan. And then in Japan, they began to use the word Zen, right? So Zen Buddhism first emerged in the Korean Peninsula, right? So when we think of Zen Buddhism today, we usually think of Japan, but this is an important hint, right, in terms of the flow of cultural influence across Northeast Asia, that it first came to China Then it was in the Korean Peninsula, ultimately got adopted in the Japanese archipelago. All right, so Buddhism went to Japan via the Korean Peninsula. Um, Along with that was, like, for example, the written language, where Chinese script was adopted but utilized for the Korean spoken tongue. And that was known as the Idu script or Hanga. And here is an example of that, where you look at it, if you can read Chinese, these all look like Chinese characters to me, but they are meaningless as Chinese characters. And what they are Chinese script upon which the phonetic system of the spoken tongue on the Korean Peninsula was basically, sort of represented by this particular writing code. Now, this text is dated to the late 19th century. So by the 19th century, you have what is recognized as, what we can recognize today as Korean script, right? Hangul. And so this is a dictionary. So in the 19th century, this dictionary would have been used to transliterate a classical text that was written in, the Chinese script, Chinese adopted script, and what would be the equivalent Korean phrase in Hangul, which is what we see today in terms of the Korean script. This will be the equivalent, right? So this would be one. This is the transliteration, and this is essentially a dictionary of both languages. That if you were a scholar, you would utilize that to try to sort of navigate between the two sort of written scripts of the Korean spoken language. One that was classical, the Idu Chinese-based script, and then of course the Hangul, which is the one that was developed in the 19th century. So what is the impact of China and Korea on Japan? So we see that China's impact on the Korean Peninsula was quite substantial, right? Chinese military conquest of the North Korean Peninsula provided the impetus for that acceleration in the state development process in the Korean Peninsula. And then that occurred over a 500-600 year period, so much so that by the middle of the first millennium AD, you see these Korean kingdoms that were really very prolific, but a lot of, sort of external or adopted, characteristics that seem to come from China, right? And so then the question, of course, is what about Japan, right? How did Japan begin to develop and shift, right, its developmental trajectory such that it began to look like the Sinosphere or the Chinese sphere as well, okay, in the first millennium AD. And so I think one of the most important things, of course, is to remember the nature of communication across the Sea of Japan. So the easiest way to get to the Korean Peninsula back from to the Japanese archipelago, or from the Japanese archipelago to the Korean Peninsula or mainland Asia, was by sea, and the Sea of Japan was the easiest sort of space to do this crossing, right? And then by the 3rd century BC, you see the knowledge of rice cultivation, which is primarily an mainland East Asian sort of practice, particularly in the south, in the sort of subtropical zones of China, being sort of adopted in Japan by the Yayoi culture, which were people who were migrating from the north parts of places like the Korean Peninsula and North China into the Japanese archipelago around about the 3rd century BC. So as these people moved across from the mainland of Asia across to the Japanese archipelago, they brought with them rice cultivation, which was what was practiced in China and the Korean Peninsula by this juncture. And along with that was a whole sort of series and period of Korean migration to Japan, where you then started to see things like the Korean systems of knowledge being sort of brought into Yayoi culture in Japan by about the 1st century BC onwards. And that goes on for a couple of centuries, including the spread of Buddhism, for example. Once it has been adopted and entrenched in the Korean Peninsula, societies begin to move, right, with the trade and migration links across the Sea of Japan from the Korean Peninsula to the Japanese archipelago. Around one of the best and earliest records of the adoption of Buddhism in Japan at the state level is a is a textual entry that we have in Japan that talks about the introduction of Zen Buddhism or Chan Buddhism into Japan through the kingdom of Bakje. So it was a diplomatic uh, discourse, a diplomatic mission that was sent from Korea to Japan, and along with that, the dignitaries from Bakje brought with them Buddhism and introduced it to the Japanese court, and the Japanese court thought it was wonderful. And so in 538, which is when this mission occurred, Japan officially adopted Buddhism as a state religion. All right, so something that happened in Korea about maybe 200 years ago via the Chinese, 200 years later was occurring in Japan by the Koreans. And the impact was, of course, one, there was a massive population explosion around about the 2nd century BC because of the planting of rice, right? The other one was large-scale mobilization was beginning to occur in the Japanese archipelago by about the 3rd century AD. And so the whole nature of state formation and the role of the state in society, and how did you capitalize on your agricultural output and your population capabilities, things that we saw in China in the 1st millennium BC and even earlier, and in the Korean Peninsula by the middle of the 1st millennium BC was starting to occur in Japan around about 300 AD. Okay, and so on the Japanese archipelago, what we see is by about 250 AD, you have the establishment of what is known as the Yamato Kingdom, right? And all it means is that there was a fief lord who was recognized by all the other fief lords in the region of the Yamato plain as the first amongst equals, right? And along with that, some sort of basic, sort of tributary offerings that were sent from these fiefs up to the ruler of the Yamato kingdom, or the Yamato fief, and that went on for about 300 years. And the Yamato state, although in principle lasted for about, I want to say, 500 years between 250 to 794, were primarily marked by 3 periods. One was known as the Kofun period. The second one, by about the middle of the 6th century AD, saw the emergence of what was known as the Asuka period. And the third one, the Nara period, started around about 710 AD to 794. And these terms are terms that indicate where the capitals were located, right? With the exception of Kofun. So Nara is the name of the capital city from about 710 to 794, right? Azuka is the name of the city, the capital city, from 538 to 710. And the Kofun period is really the name of the kind of tombs that were starting to be built by about 250 to 538. And so the Japanese historians have called this period the Kofun period. So how is this different from what was occurring before that? So prior to 250 AD, on the Japanese archipelago, you saw the development of increasingly powerful fiefs, right? But these are tribal societies. So tribal societies are interesting in the sense that the land doesn't really belong to the tribal chief, right? He might take a cut of the produce of the land, but the lands and the output primarily belong to the families that were resident in the land and tilling the land. Okay. The other thing that's really interesting about tribal societies or tribal fiefdoms, which was what was existing on the Japanese archipelago until about 250 AD, is that you don't typically have monumental architecture being built. So if you think about China, for example, the Shang Dynasty, right? The monumental burials sites that we saw during the Shang Dynasty, right? All of those do not come up until some kind of a state is developed and there's an ability to exploit large numbers of people, right? So social, human mobilization is probably one of the most important keys or characteristics of state formational process, right? Complex state formational process in East Asia. And in the Japanese archipelago, that does not happen until about 250 AD. out of which interesting sort of monumental building projects begin to emerge, right? So you have these things that look like keyholes here, right? And they're quite huge on the landscape. Essentially, they were burial sites of the rulers of the Yamato kingdom. And so by about the 3rd century AD, Japanese kings of the Yamato kingdom or Yamato fief were able to mobilize their population bases, right, to spend time and labor building these monumental tombs, right, for which they would be eventually interred once they passed away. And these monumental structures became institutionalized. That's why you see so many of them, for example, on this one landscape in the region of Kansai, for example, which is near modern-day Osaka. Okay, and this is a flat plain. It's one of the largest flat plains on the main island of Japan, and because of that, the ability to exploit that for agricultural purposes, lent itself to large population bases being developed here after 300 BC, when rice cultivation, along with irrigation techniques and all that were developed on the mainland in places like China, for example, and Korea, were exported to the Japanese archipelago, right? So here's another one, which is the 4th century AD Kofun, and these are called Kofun, and that's the reason why the period is known as the Kofun period. And this period where they were building these monumental burial sites for the rulers of the Yamato fief or kingdom goes on until about the middle of the 6th century AD. Okay, so these are pretty large, sort of burial sites that were built in a particular way, had a really interesting sort of form, and kind of looked like keyholes. Okay, that's the reason why they call them keyhole burials. And they're quite large. I mean, this one, for example, from this end to this end, is about 900 feet. And that's roughly 300 meters, which is about, if you think of the length of a track and field, which is about 100 meters long, that's 3 times the length of a track and field, right? So there's a substantial amount of space that is being manipulated and transformed, right, through human effort. Okay, so that you could create a mount of this nature where there would be a burial chamber somewhere in there. And so this is a really, really large undertaking. There would be a moat all around here, which would be filled with water, through rain, through seasonal rain. And so this is a really, really important sort of, expression, right, of state management and state control, right, societal control as well. And lining the edges, so let me use a different color pen if I might. Lining the edges of this entire site here would have been these really interesting clay figurines, right? Both animal as well as human figurines. They're known as Haniwa figurines, and they're not humongous. They're not gigantic, but they're not small. So they're roughly about 50, 60 centimeters tall, so roughly about 2 feet high. So this, for example, is roughly about 2 feet high. Okay, and so all of these clay figurines, including the horses and the animals, would be lining the edge of the tomb on the outside, right? So this will all be visible to people from the outside. Even up to now, scholars of Japanese history don't really know what they represent, other than the fact that he had the ability to do that, and obviously was an expression of the ability to mobilize society and its economic resources, its manpower resources, even its animal resources, right? And that the ruler was the focus of all of that. Okay, so I think that's the best we can go in the absence of any textual information of their purposes, and even possibly what their religious implications or representations might be. This is probably all we can go by. But just looking at this figure, for example, which is obviously a figure of a military person, I think part of that is also the the sort of expressing the manifestation of the military capabilities of the kingdom of the fief, okay, in its military capabilities and how it was able to conduct itself vis-a-vis its neighbors, right? So all of that is to say that there is a marked difference, during this period of time, all the way up until about the 6th centuries AD or 7th centuries AD, right? The Kofun period of the Yamato kingdom, where you were no longer a fief alone, but you were also essentially a really important or powerful state, right? In a landscape that was occupied by quite a number of different fiefs and fief lords, okay? And so there was a distinction that was being drawn over the centuries where the rulers of the Yamato fief or Yamato kingdom were one cut above everybody else who were fief lords in their own, respective territorial holdings. And so what you see is a duality in Yamato Japan's political structure, okay, by about the 3rd century onwards, and obviously that becomes increasingly apparent and reinforced over time, right? And that is that on the one hand, you have the centralization of society and social, sort of control, manifested in a couple of ways. One was, of course, urban planning. You get cities being developed along the lines of what a Chinese city would look like. Again, an idea that was borrowed from the Korean Peninsula, which was obviously previously borrowed from the Chinese, right? You have agricultural taxes that was imposed on all the lands, including the fiefs that were submitting themselves under the authority of the Yamato kingdom, okay? So you could tax the agricultural output of the fief lands that technically you didn't rule directly, that it had their own fief law, but because they submitted to you, you could impose these agricultural taxes on these lands, and so therefore you also benefited from that, right? The imposition of currencies, which looks like the Chinese copper currency. I have a picture for you to have a look at in a bit, but also the formation of a bureaucratic administrative system, and importantly, in terms of like religion and philosophy, Buddhism and the patronage of Buddhism was the prerogative and the purview of the Yamato kingdom ruler. All right, it wasn't something that the regional fief lords were permitted to do. So you could be a Buddhist, but that you could not, as a fief lord, be a patron, right, of Buddhism in Japan, right? You only the Yamato king or Yamato ruler, because they had female rulers as well. Only the Yamato ruler could be the patron of Buddhism. But at the same time, the duality also meant that there was regionalism. So centralization on the one hand, reinforcing the Yamato kingdom's sort of central authority, but at the same time, you have regionalism, which was sort of seen in the different fief lands around this space, and that represented the kind of regionalism that we have come to understand of the Japanese archipelago societies, right? So Shintoism was the religion that was very, very well practiced at the regional level. And in fact, the fief lords and even the Yamato kingdom rulers were seen as the descendants of Shinto, specific Shinto deities. So each of these different lineages of the fief lords or the rulers of the Yamato kingdom had a lineage that could be tied ultimately to a Shinto deity, okay? And then so along with that, obviously, was their religious patronage, therefore, and social patronage, therefore was based on kinship ties, lineage ties, and so family relations or familial relations form the basis upon which regional kind of social networks, right, at the fief level were occurring and were functioning. And along with that were market taxes. So as a fief lord, you could impose market taxes, but agricultural taxes was only the prerogative of the Yamato ruler. Okay, and so what you got was these really interesting things that were happening. So on the one hand, you had all these different clans, and the powerful ones had fiefs, and they were all lineage based. They were tied to a Shinto deity, which was known as a kami. And the Yamato kingdom was the first amongst equals. So this was the beginning of the first millennium AD, right? As state formational process was beginning to occur in full force, rice agricultural cultivation in the Japanese archipelago was happening in a large scale, and population was growing at a phenomenal pace. And then by the 6th centuries AD, the Yamato kingdom becoming more and more powerful because it was the only fiefdom that was able to do things like this, okay, building of the Kofun burials, right? And it sort of reinforces that power and that centrality. Around about the 6th centuries AD, with the visit of the dignitaries from the Korean kingdom of Pakche, the Yamato kingdom made the decision to adopt Buddhism as a state-sponsored religion. And along with that was that all Buddhist monks were designated as caretakers of Shinto shrines. So if you can see that structure, the religious hierarchy that was being developed, right? You had the king or the ruler, right, with Buddhism, okay, at the top. And then you had down at the next layer, the Buddhist monks, okay. And then further down, therefore, would be what? All the Shinto shrines, okay? And so if you look at this, what it means is that the Yamato state was essentially trying to impose, right, and very successfully imposed a religious hierarchical structure upon Japanese society by the 6th centuries AD, all right? And once it could do that, and because your political legitimacy as fief lords were based on your claim, right, to the lineage that ultimately tied you to a deity, a Shinto deity. If the king, the Yamato king, had his Buddhist monks being caretakers of Shinto shrines, okay, so ultimately your deity, the kami, came under the authority of the Buddhist authority, right, or Buddhism. And the Buddhist deities is not really quite the right word, but like the Bodhisattvas and Buddha, okay. And so once you can do that, and that's the basis of political legitimacy in a Japanese society at this time, you could then institute a whole series of political reforms, which they did in the 7th centuries AD, including the bureaucracy, the imposition of a Chinese penal code, for example, was just adopted wholesale and then implemented in the Yamato state. Chinese urban planning, agricultural taxation, and the Yamato chief then became what was known as a king, right? And no longer a first amongst equals, but you became essentially the king, right? And you were no longer the first amongst equals, but you were one above everybody else. So much so that the other chieftains had to swear allegiance to you. Otherwise, your military might choose to absorb that particular fief into your holding. Okay, so here's just a picture of Mount Fuji, which is in essence the manifestation and the abode of a Shinto deity known as Asama no Okami, which is the progenitor from which the lineage of the Yamato fief lords and ultimately the Yamato kingdom rulers, right, claim their ancestry from, right? So Mount Fuji is huge, right? You can actually see it from a plane when you're flying into Tokyo. And so for you to claim that this was your deity, your kami deity, meant that you're pretty big and important and powerful. Okay, and so like even in terms of the Shinto deities, there was some kind of hierarchical system, but the imposition of Buddhism as a state religion, and then the Buddhist monks being the caretakers of Shinto shrines in the middle of the round about the 6th century AD, made it even more a hierarchical system upon which the Yamato state benefited from. And one of the most important so-called deities or incarnations of the Buddha that that the Yamato kingdom sort of adopted as its deity, right? Its Buddhist deity was Varukana, and Varukana is known in the Buddhist canon as the supreme deity. It's the most important and most powerful overarching reincarnation, right, of the Buddha. Okay, so if that is your deity, right, everybody therefore falls under, right, your political authority and rule. Okay, and so this is this particular um, Buddhist statue or idol is housed in the Todaiji Temple, which I think we are actually going to visit it in a video as well as a virtual visit on the 20th of October. All right, so when we look at East Asian cosmopolitanism in Japan at the end of the first millennium AD, we'll be looking at a few videos and a visit to this particular UNESCO site, okay, UNESCO World Heritage Site. So just a heads up, but it's a pretty important expression, all right, centrality of the Yamato ruler, okay. And then by the 7th century, the Japanese Yamato kingdom began to adopt copper coinage and began to cast its own coins, which, as you can tell from what we're seeing here, is highly similar to the Chinese copper coinage, right? And so that becomes the basis of the fiscal system in Japan. And it's interesting that they decided that they would adopt something that looks like a Chinese fiscal tool, okay? The city of Nara, where you get the term the Nara period, right, which was built by one of the rulers of the Yamato kingdom at its height, right, in the 8th century AD, looks like a Chinese city from the 8th century, okay? So I think we're going to have a class lecture on cosmopolitanism in East Asia at the end of the first millennium AD. And there you will see more detailed sort of discussion. We'll have a more detailed discussion of the cities in East Asia, Japanese city, for example, the Korean cities, and the Chinese cities. And you can really see the similitude where they got the blueprint from and how much they actually stuck to it, okay? But at least for the moment now, the old Kofun, right, tombs that were built all the way up until about the middle of the 6th centuries AD by the Yamato kingdom rulers, are still here, right? These are the old ones. And then in its vicinity by the 8th centuries AD, you have the Yamato ruler essentially deciding to plonk what is effectively a Chinese-looking city on the landscape, and that becomes the key administrative sort of epicenter, right, of the Yamato kingdom in the 8th century AD. And they only used it for about 100 years, so it wasn't very long, but you can see the amount of effort and people involved. All of these are individual cubes, squares here, right? Each of these are walled villages. And so the city had like 108 wards or something like that. Very similar to the capital of Chang'an in the Tang Dynasty, right? From the 7th century onwards. And it's exactly the same logic, it's exactly the same layout. And we'll see some of those images, I think, in about 2 classes from today, right? But essentially the same sort of lexicon, okay? So the result, and we're coming, up to the end of today's class session here. The result is that by about the middle of the first millennium AD, you started to see, right, a diverse geographical landscape beginning to converge into a synchronized cultural landscape, right? So prior to the first millennium AD, the Japanese archipelago was on a very different developmental trajectory compared to the Korean Peninsula, and then compared to the Chinese landmass, right? Each on fairly different developmental trajectories. And by the middle of the first millennium AD, with the spread of cultural influence and sort of the administrative structures, centralization of authority, economic resources, so on and so forth. By the middle of the first millennium AD, you see this region of Northeast Asia beginning to look quite similar to each other, right? And all of that was based on aspects of the Chinese cultural state, right? The language of officialdom, the currency tools for fiscal management, um, uh, agricultural output based on rice and cereal propagation, the taxation that came from that, the bureaucratic structure, even the penal code, for example, that was adopted in Japan by the 8th centuries AD. All of that resulted in what we call now the Sinosphere, right? And so the middle of the, or rather the first millennium BC, first millennium AD, sorry, was a critical period of time in Northeast Asian history because it's the first time that this region becomes a synchronized cultural zone. Okay, and then from there uh, to even up to today, we would then see for the next 1,500 years shared characteristics and interactions that didn't occur before, but by the middle of the first millennium AD, really began to represent what Northeast Asia is about, right, as a singular extended geographical zone. Okay, so just to end off, a couple of things to think about in looking ahead. Of course, the repercussions of the early first millennium AD fundamentally important for our understanding for the next 1,500 years. Okay, the growth of networks across East Asia would be one, both land-based between China and Korean Peninsula, for example, but also maritime between China, the Korean Peninsula, and the Japanese archipelago, right? And all of those networks facilitated the maritime were facilitated by maritime networks that developed by the 2nd centuries AD. Okay, so it wasn't just land networks we were looking at, it was also sea networks. And the thing about sea networks that's important is that the volume that you can transfer by ships because of the large displacement of the vessels was always a lot more than what you could do across land, right? Which had to rely on pack animals or humans to pull carts and all, and that sort of thing. The volume of exchange was always relatively smaller compared to maritime networks where large ships were utilized, okay? And of course, the result of it was the development of an East Asian cultural sphere. So I'll leave all of that with you for today. And don't forget to view your virtual museum visit at the Korean National Museum, and we'll come back together as a class on Wednesday to have a class discussion on some of the things that we see in the museum, okay, and the cultural exchanges and interactions that went on in East Asia in the middle of the first millennium AD, of which the Kingdom of Gaia, at least in terms of this museum gallery, is the focus, right, the case study, right, of those things.